Some of the goals of our webinar today are for you to gain some foundational knowledge, and the subjects that we hope that you start to reflect on and take away from this are about the Chignecto corridor case study and habitat connectivity in that area, as well as a larger concept. Also, there'll be examples of integrating Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous-led area-based conservation, and the importance of monitoring data analysis and wildlife connectivity in adaptation work. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Kelsey Butler and Adam Cheeseman, who are joining us today for this presentation. Over to you guys. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to go to our first slide. Okay, thanks for the intro. And I'm so excited that so many people are interested in our project. So today, Adam and I will be giving an overview of our Chignecto Isthmus Ecological Corridor project that's funded by Parks Canada. And Adam will be focusing in on the engagement part of the project and some case studies regarding wildlife crossings that we think would benefit this area. So I know that there was just a land acknowledgement given, but I would also like to give one. I just want to acknowledge that I personally live and work in Wolastoquk, particularly Eppahawk or Fredericton, New Brunswick, on the traditional, modern, and unceded territory of the Wolastoquk Nation. And the work that I'm going to be talking about today is located within Mi'kma'ki, which is the traditional, modern, and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. The Chignecto Isthmus, as many of us know it, is located within the Signic district, which means drainage place. So it's very amply named. I strongly believe that conservation in Canada needs to be Indigenous led. And I am happy to say that we have two Indigenous organizations as partners on this project. I feel like it would be inappropriate without them. And a land acknowledgement, to me, is only useful if there is action attached to it. So I would really urge everyone on this call to take some time today to further your education as a treaty person, support an Indigenous-owned business, lend your voice to supporting Indigenous issues. As allies, it is important that we stand up for inherent and treaty rights. And I know sometimes folks can feel unsure or worried that they might say or do the wrong thing, but speaking up in support the treaties we represent. Personally, I am a treaty person for the peace and friendship treaties. That's part of the job, is to speak up. So the treaties that I represent never surrendered lands, waters, or resources, which I feel like is important to include. So I will talk about Birds Canada just for a quick second. That's where I work. We're a national charity focused on bird conservation, and our mission is to engage people through science to protect the birds we love so that all bird species in Canada are thriving in healthy and diverse habitats. And we produce reports like State of Canada's Birds, our Birdwatch magazine, etc. And now I will let Adam introduce Nature MB.
Yeah, hi everybody, and thanks for being here today. It's great to see such a good crowd. So yeah, as mentioned, I work for an organization called Nature MB. We work across New Brunswick to connect New Brunswickers to nature, and our missions to celebrate, conserve, and protect New Brunswick's natural heritage. So we have a range of different projects related to species at risk conservation and nature education, and we also represent and support over a dozen different nature clubs around the province from every corner of the province. So we have about 1,000 or so strong network of naturalists and nature lovers that are part of our organization. Yeah, really happy to have been collaborating with Birds Canada and with all the other partners on this work for the last the last year or so. So yeah, excited to be here, and thanks for having us.
Great. So I was actually going to start this off by saying, as many of you are probably aware, but as I see in the chat, there are so many folks from across the country. So for those of you who aren't aware, The Chignecto Isthmus actually has many other collaborations happening, which is why I'm kind of explaining where this one came from. There's a Chignecto community nominated priority place, but this project came from Parks Canada funding that was launched in June of 2024, where they called for proposals for their National Ecological Corridor program. And as you may or may not be able to see based on my small map, they funded 23 other corridor projects across the country with this funding, and it is to support conservation planning and actions that enhance wildlife connectivity between natural habitat that could be protected or not protected. And we saw this funding as an opportunity to provide increased capacity for work in the region while having a greater focus on corridor connectivity. And I'm just going to include the Parks Canada definition for ecological corridors since they did fund this project. And it is a clearly defined geographical space where governance, management, and stewardship over the long term maintain or restore effective ecological connectivity while upholding stewardship values. And as Adam mentioned, this project is a true collaboration. So many of these organizations have been working in the Chignecto Isthmus for years and years. We're so thankful for all of our collaborators. So I really just wanted to give them a moment and have their logos shown, because these are our partners and they're doing great work that I will get into briefly. So why is connectivity important for Chignecto? So I think we understand, you can see on this map that the Chignecto Isthmus acts as a corridor for people, for transportation, and for wildlife. And this map is kind of like our piece de resistance. Parks Canada partnered with Canadian Geographic to highlight each ecological corridor project, and this is our map. And as you can see, it highlights terrestrial wildlife movements and also avian migration hubs throughout the region. The map was made using CanVec data from Natural Resources Canada and the Chignecto Isthmus Region Connectivity Report from NCC in 2016. And this area holds so many different designations. It has the international recognition as being a UNESCO biosphere reserve. The region has over 44 species at risk and over 250 species of conservation concern. It's an important junction of the Atlantic Flyway that supports globally significant avian biodiversity. The corridor also links numerous protected areas, a few being Fundy National Park, Amlongug First Nation IPCAs, Cannonbog NB Protected Natural Area, Hopewell Rocks, like there's more, I won't name them all. But it's a pretty special place and we're really lucky to be working on a project here. So what are we doing? This is a really important area to protect. And what is the corridor project in particular doing? So we have 4 key objectives that are supported by numerous activities. And these objectives are supporting the gathering and sharing of Indigenous knowledge. And a large portion of the funds for this project are going directly to Amlongug First Nation for land acquisition to become IPCAs that support community needs as well as connectivity. We are also greatly scaling up our data collection within the area and monitoring efforts to better understand pinch points, species movement, and important areas for wildlife. We have also developed a robust stakeholder and public engagement strategy that will target key issues such as wildlife crossings at pinch points. And then moving forward, we will create an adaptive management strategy based on the results of the monitoring activities to help inform engagement and policy moving forward. So I'm going to get into each of these briefly to give you an overview of what we're doing. So there was an Indigenous Knowledge Community Values Mapping Workshop and a summer science camp held in Amlongug First Nation in July and was supported by Anquotum Resource Management. They had really great attendance and really great interest shown by the community. And Anquotum has reviewed all of the workshop information and come up with a list of species. They're currently working on the Mi'kmaq translations for these species as well. And like I said, this project is supporting the purchase of private lands by Amlangug First Nation to become IPCAs. And these lands are being protected for future generations, for Mi'kmaq land use activities, and for conserving biodiversity and increasing connectivity. So on top of the Indigenous knowledge work being done and Amlangug Conservation's ecological data collection and monitoring that they're doing in-house, we have several groups that are increasing their data collection and monitoring in the project area. And so this is basically to help increase the information that we can draw from to inform connectivity decisions. And this can include like what parcels of land should we prioritize for purchase? Are there really big areas of biodiversity that we need to think about protecting? Areas for targeted engagement, which municipalities and landowners should we be talking to? Where should wildlife crossings be considered, or signage, stuff like that. And so each of the organizations are doing something. So the Fundy Biosphere Region, they're doing carbon inventories and wetland assessments. EOS, Eco Energy, is doing water quality monitoring. Nature MB is doing wildlife camera installations at suspected pinch points. We are doing extended marsh monitoring and nightjar surveys, and Modus, which is affiliated with Birds Canada, is doing a data analysis of stations within the corridor project area. I am going to talk a little bit more in depth about what Birds Canada is doing specifically. When we have questions, please don't ask me detailed questions about the other group's work because they know it best. I'm not an expert in exactly what they're doing, just as a heads up. So for Birds Canada, how do birds help us understand connectivity? And so when I was working with the cartographer at Canadian Geographic on the map that I showed earlier, he was kind of surprised to learn that Birds Canada was leading this project, because he admitted to me when he thought about ecological connectivity, he just thought about terrestrial land mammals, which is totally fair. I think maybe if you're not thinking about it, birds kind of just, you think about a flyway. But obviously, birds do use land. They use it for roosting, for breeding, for eating. And they're actually really great indicators of connectivity. And this is because they can use multiple habitat patches within a given year. They can indicate the presence of specific habitat types because they often have specialized preferences. Many are long distance migrants that require networks of stopover sites to refuel. They're easy to observe and identify sometimes. And they're good indicators of ecosystem health because they often eat other animals, so they're susceptible to the bioaccumulation of contaminants. And because they're highly mobile, which means that, it's easy for them to switch locations, if they change their distributions or the patches of habitat that they're using, this could be a good early signal of habitat health and what's working for them versus what isn't. And so when we were thinking about what types of monitoring we wanted to do in this area, we decided to add monitoring routes for both our Maritimes Marsh Monitoring Program and our nightjar survey, and the nightjar survey, I should say. The Marsh Monitoring Program collects data on wetland dependent species and has a primary 12 focal species. But amphibians and plants are also a part of this survey, which helps us to gather knowledge of wetland species, habitat associations, and habitat features. The North American Nightjar Survey is a roadside survey that monitors the common nighthawk and eastern whippoorwills. And we chose both of these because they collect data on species distribution for two different groups. So the Marsh Monitoring Program obviously focuses on water birds. The Nightjar Survey focuses on aerial insectivores. And they're annual surveys, which means that they can provide long-term data sets. And we focus more heavily on expanding the Marsh Monitoring Program because of the habitat data that can be used to determine the distribution of suitable habitat. Okay. And so I just wanted to show kind of um, how this project is impacting our monitoring. And so in 2024, you can see we only had about 4 marsh monitoring routes in the project area, which is great, but obviously we could do better. So with this funding, we were able to scale up significantly in the area. And now we have 20 marsh monitoring routes, including coastal wetland areas, which will give us great information for the project. So that's just a direct benefit of this project funding. So what MODIS is doing, actually who MODIS is, first of all, it's a program of Birds Canada where international research community is working together to study the movement and behavior of birds, bats, and insects. So these animals carry miniaturized tags that use like automated radio telemetry to transmit information to stations across the landscape. Um, and I had asked one of my colleagues, Lucas, to put together a map with some of the MODIS data that they had within the corridor. So that's what you're looking at right now, which is really interesting, I think, and kind of a cool visual. And the goals for their data analysis for this program are to find out where and when the birds are flying over by versus stopping in the area. They're going to be looking at tracks across the whole study area and the directionality of those tracks, the route choice of passerines and shorebirds when transitioning between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia and vice versa, and the retention time for birds in the area. How long are they staying? Where are they staying? That type of information, which will be really great to add to the data collection for this project. And now I'm going to hand it over to Adam, who is going to talk about the fun, I think the fun aspects of this project. So engagement, trail cams, and wildlife crossings.
Thanks, Kelsey. That was awesome. Yeah, and happy to answer any questions obviously at the end with for some of the pieces that I'm going to talk about. But as Kelsey mentioned, I'm going to talk about our engagement strategy, which is kind of one objective or piece of this broader initiative. And it's in coordination with Nature NB, Fundy Biosphere Region, EOS Eco Energy, and the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society New Brunswick chapter. Um, and so what we've been doing under this strategy is really kind of coming together and trying to think about what are some key messages and kind of key players that we want to engage around, protected and conserved areas and ecological connectivity in the Chignecto Isthmus. And what are we hoping that, the various different audiences from, residents that live here to visitors that come here to our municipalities and our regional service commission, what can we all do to help support connectivity and try to embed it within our various different roles as land use planners or nonprofits or community-based organizations or even as individuals. And so another piece of this focuses on working with Parks Canada as well in terms of the national historic sites and the national parks that are kind of in our project area to ensure that we are again integrating that connectivity piece into those operations and kind of into plans about how those lands are managed in the future. So I'm going to talk a little bit about specifically what we've been working on over the last little bit around thinking around road ecology and thinking around wildlife crossings and how wildlife are moving across roads, which is a big obvious concern in a lot of places, but particularly in these kind of regions like the Chignecto Isthmus that are, experience this huge flow. You saw the map that Kelsey showed earlier of, in a lot of cases, large terrestrial mammals, but also lots of other species that are trying to move through the region between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And in the Isthmus in particular, we have, a few, really high traffic roadways that kind of bisect the north-south roughly intersection of the isthmus, and so there's a lot of potential impact there in terms of wildlife collisions and impacts on wildlife, and those have been kind of well documented in the region for many years. So we're starting to think about how do we work with our partners and with other government agencies to start to think about this from a perspective of signage and driver behavior, but also thinking about this idea of wildlife crossings. So I just want to show this quick video that was developed by Parks Canada a number of years ago, highlighting a project that they've been working on in Keushpakwak National Park, a little bit further north. And I think one thing I find that's really nice and cool about this video is that it kind of frames the conversation, not only around this kind of large terrestrial mammals that we're so used to thinking about when it comes to wildlife crossings, but also thinking about smaller things like reptiles and amphibians and how they move across roadways. So Mintaka, if you're ready to try to share that, that'd be great. Awesome, thank you. Yeah, so that again, an example of an interesting project where they're looking at reptiles and amphibians and how they get across. Um, and so it's important for us to, yeah, again, not just think about those large terrestrial mammals, but also all the other species that are moving back and forth, including birds, like Kelsey mentioned, and how they move across areas like the isthmus. Um, and with, actually, we can go back to the next slide. Perfect. Thanks, Mintaka. Okay, awesome. Yeah, so there's obviously lots of different designs when it comes to wildlife crossings as well. So we're not just talking about overpasses, but we're also talking about these underpasses, whether they be open bottom culvert systems, or in the picture in the bottom right is actually a wildlife underpass here in New Brunswick. And there's various different designs for various different things. But as you saw in the video, you know, generally speaking, these types of systems can benefit multiple different species, even with bears squeezing through those little tunnels. Um, and for areas like the Chignecto Isthmus, it's particularly important, um, for a number of reasons, thinking about the various different wildlife that go across the corridor, but also just the different type of drivers that we have here. For anyone who, I saw when we started the call that there's lots of folks from Ontario and kind of other parts of Canada on the call. And so if you've ever been, visiting PEI in the summer and got your cow's ice cream and crossed the bridge and started to come across to New Brunswick and drove down the highway towards Sackville or towards Nova Scotia. You're driving in the isthmus, and there's people from all across Canada, all over the world that are driving on these roads. So from a wildlife crossing perspective, it's the signage piece is really important. So these are the kind of conversations that all of our groups are trying to have and kind of think about and trying to be more strategic in how we engage and kind of work with different departments, for example, that are responsible for these things. And what we found in doing a little bit of digging into the research is that, in other places where they have these, by strategically building this type of crossing infrastructure, particularly in areas that we know are important for animal migratory patterns, some public projects have been known to reduce wildlife collisions by more than 90%. And even under the most expensive proposals or scenarios, the net benefit of these structures, even just from an economic perspective, remains positive if you're looking at an area that could experience, a little over 25 collisions each year. So definitely a very interesting type of thing. And if another piece of that puzzle is thinking about how this relates to climate change adaptation. So this study that I reference here, and more studies that are coming out, and more conversations that we're starting to have as a project team, is really thinking about, okay, so if we're going to be advocating and kind of engaging different groups around the need for these types of wildlife crossings, what kind of role do those play in an adaptation or climate perspective? So there's kind of two ways that I kind of see it. There's like the benefits in terms of having these types of things from an adaptation perspective, and also how we need to work in climate change into their design and where we put them. And so for the first, when we're thinking about open bottom culvert systems, when we're thinking about overpass systems, those systems can help us play a role in preparing communities for climate change. And so we can strategically also integrate that lens when we're thinking about wildlife road crossings. Um, and thinking around, okay, is this also an area that's experiencing flooding on the roadway? Are the culverts undersized from a climate perspective? And so integrating this idea of wildlife crossings into that adaptation perspective and thinking about the schedule of road work is also really important, because these systems can help us, convey stormwater from one side of the road to another, in terms of those open bottom culvert systems, for example, helping from an adaptation perspective. And when I'm talking about, climate also informing where these go, as many of us are familiar with, there's, projected range shifts in a number of different species as a result of climate change. And so when we're thinking about where these structures go, given that it's a large infrastructure project and likely it'd be nested in, the timelines of how roads are upgraded, um, we really need to think about, okay, is this the best place right now for this structure based on how wildlife are moving across the landscape? But how is that going to shift in the future? So are the species that we're kind of targeting with these crossing structures going to be here in 20 years? Are they going to be a little bit further north? Are they going to be a little bit further over here? And so all these different things are, really important from a climate perspective that I wanted to kind of highlight, just, given the topic of the webinar today. And so this, yeah, again, examples of the kind of work that we're trying to do in terms of figuring out how to best engage on these types of topics. And so how do we actually decide where these things go in terms of crossings? And also we're thinking about, signage and thinking about other engagement strategies around reducing wildlife collisions in this important area. And so we have done work, and that Kelsey mentioned, that kind of inform that Canadian geographic map as well, that focuses on modeling for large terrestrial mammals the kind of main pinch points along the isthmus. And so using this and data, and also thinking about this climate change piece, and also thinking about aquatic connectivity. So that's a piece that's also been integrated into this project through some work that EOS Ecoenergy is doing on the watershed monitoring side of things, in terms of figuring out, how can aquatic connectivity also play a role in conversations around ecological connectivity, but also at a really, fine scale conversations about where we're making upgrades to infrastructure to help wildlife. So we're not just thinking about terrestrial, but we're also thinking about aquatic. Um, and so for us, what's the outcome of this project? And so zooming back out to the project as a whole, we've talked about, Kelsey highlighted some of the high level pieces of the project. We talked a little bit about our engagement strategy and kind of a very specific example within our engagement strategy of the types of things that we're thinking about. Really what we're hopeful for is being able to continue to build on this momentum. So we've been able to, come together as a partnership and come together as a group and make some really good headway and have some really good conversations. And in some cases, make some really, on the ground strides in terms of conserving and protecting the Chignecto Isthmus for wildlife connectivity. And what we're hoping for is a renewal of this ecological corridor fund, so we can have the capacity to continue this work. And all of our partners are very committed to working together to understand the changes that we're seeing, and to continue to work together to address kind of these big questions. Because a lot of the work that we're doing under this project isn't just, something we can do in a year or something we can do in 2 years. These are, really long conversations with, a diverse group of different rights holders and stakeholders, and thinking about, how do we do better at improving connectivity in this super, super important area. And obviously layered on top of that, there's a lot of big, changes that are happening in the region that we're adapting to and thinking about in the context of this project too. And so all the information that we're doing and all the work that we're doing is also going to inform future public outreach work, future engagement work, to explain why we need better land stewards to protect species at risk and habitat for improved wildlife connectivity. So with that, we'll pause and say again, thank you very much. Thank you to Parks Canada for supporting us in this work, and to all of our partners who were, speaking about this project on behalf of today. So yeah, on behalf of Kelsey and I, it's been a really a pleasure to be here, and have lots of time for questions and comments, and we'll do our best to answer those. And for, as Kelsey mentioned, if there are specific questions about components of the project that we're not as familiar with, we'll definitely put you in touch with the right people. So yeah, I think we're good to jump into the Q&A section if that works for you too, Kelsey. Yeah, perfect. Thumbs up.
Sure
Wonderful.
does.
Thank you so much, Adam and Kelsey. That was a stellar presentation, and I loved how engaged you both were with this project.